My brother stood in my parents' living room, the one with the bay window I'd repainted 3 summers ago, and told me with complete calm that the house was his now, that Mum and Dad had always intended it for him, that I should be grateful I'd had somewhere to send the payments all these years, and I want you to understand that I had been transferring money into that mortgage account every single month for 7 years. Never missed once, never asked for recognition, never put my name above the door. And the look on his face when I opened my bag and placed the folder on the coffee table is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not with anger, with something much quieter than that. With the particular satisfaction of a woman who kept every single receipt. Welcome back. So glad you're here, truly. Because this one took me a long time to be ready to tell, and now that I am, I need you to stay with me all the way to the end, because the ending is the part that matters most. Leave me a comment when something lands. Hit subscribe if you're new. Let's get into it. My name is Naomi Baxter. I'm 39 years old. I live in Leeds, and I have one brother, Connor, who is 3 years older than me and who has spent most of his adult life being, in our mother's words, the one who needs a little more patience, which is a gentle way of saying that he has made a series of significant financial decisions that have not gone particularly well and has relied on the family to absorb the consequences of those decisions without ever quite saying thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it. I want to be fair to Connor because I think fairness matters even when someone has genuinely wronged you. So I will say this. He is not a cruel person. He is not calculating in the cold, deliberate way that some people are. He is instead someone who has always moved through life with the quiet assumption that things will work out, that people around him will step in when they don't, and that this arrangement is simply how things are, rather than something that costs other people anything real. That assumption served him reasonably well for years because our parents are generous people who find it very difficult to say no to either of their children, but most especially to Connor, because Connor has always been the one who needed it more, who asked more openly, who made it harder to refuse, while I was the one who didn't ask and so was never offered. My parents' house is a 3-bedroom semi in a nice part of Harrogate, the kind of street where people wash their cars on Sundays and the neighbors know each other's names. And my parents bought it in the early 90s, and it has been the fixed point of our whole family for as long as I can remember. When my father had his first heart issue 7 years ago, everything shifted. He was 64, my mother was 62, and the mortgage still had 9 years left to run, which sat uncomfortably against his reduced working hours and her part-time income, and the general reality that retirement was closer than their finances were quite ready for. I was 32, working as a senior operations manager for a logistics company in Leeds, earning well, living in a flat I rented, and when my mother sat me down and explained quietly that they were worried about keeping up with the payments, I said, without a great deal of deliberation, that I would cover the mortgage and that they should not worry about it. She cried a little. My father said he'd pay me back. I said they absolutely would not, that it wasn't a loan, that it was just money, and that the house staying in the family was more important than the number. Connor was not at that conversation. Connor was living in Bristol at the time, in a flat he was renting with a girlfriend, working in sales for a company that would let him go 8 months later. And when I told him what I'd arranged, he said, "That's really good of you." Nom. In the warm, uncomplicated way, he says things that he has already processed and filed as sorted. He did not offer to contribute. I did not ask him to. That was my first mistake, not asking. But at 32, I still believed that doing the right thing and being seen to do the right thing were the same event. And I had not yet learned that they are often completely separate. The payments went out every month without drama. £940, direct debit. The first of every month for 7 years, which, if you want the number, is £78,960, which I know precisely because I am an operations manager and numbers are what I do, and because somewhere around year 3 I started keeping a very organized folder of every transaction, every bank statement, every correspondence with the mortgage provider, not because I was planning anything, but because I am the kind of person who documents things, who keeps records, who files rather than piles, and that habit, that completely unglamorous administrative habit, turned out to be the most important thing I ever did. My parents knew what I was doing. They thanked me regularly, in the private, warm way that families thank each other, And they stopped worrying about the house, which was the entire point. Connor moved back to the north eventually, settled in York, met a woman named Diane who I genuinely like, had 2 children who I genuinely love, and began coming to Harrogate for Sundays and holidays and the general rhythm of family life, which was lovely. It was exactly what I wanted. I am not someone who resents a brother for living his life. What I did not know, because nobody told me, was that during this period my parents had updated their wills. My father mentioned it once in passing, said they'd been to see a solicitor, said everything was sorted, said not to worry, and I did not press because I trusted them completely. And pressing felt like the kind of thing you do when you're thinking about inheritance, rather than just loving your parents. And I was not thinking about inheritance. I was thinking about my father's heart and my mother's happiness and the house staying exactly as it was. My father died 18 months ago, peacefully, at home, which was what he wanted, and the grief of it is its own enormous thing that I will not reduce by summarizing here, except to say that the weeks after were the hardest of my life, and also that they were when I first understood that something was wrong. Not because anyone said anything, but because of what wasn't said. Connor stepped into the space my father left in a way that felt natural at first. Practical, helpful, he was there at the house often. He helped with things that needed doing. He was kind to my mother. And I was grateful, because grief makes you grateful for anyone who shows up and does something useful. It was about 2 months after the funeral that my mother mentioned, carefully, gently, with the particular carefulness of someone delivering information they know is difficult, that my father had left the house to Connor. She said it had been their decision together, that Connor had children and needed stability, that they had always planned it this way, that they hoped I understood. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked whether they had accounted for the mortgage. She looked at me in a way that told me they had not, or rather, that they had not thought of it as the same conversation, which is a distinction that I think speaks for itself. Connor came to the house the following Sunday. He was not unkind about it. That is genuinely true. He was actually quite warm. He said he knew it was complicated. He said he was grateful for what I'd done. He used the word grateful 3 times in about 4 minutes, which in my experience means someone is about to do something they know you won't like. He said the house was his now, legally, per the will, and that he was planning to move his family in by the summer. And then he said the thing I told you at the start, that I should be grateful I'd had somewhere to send the payments, which he said with the earnest sincerity of someone who genuinely believed it was a reasonable thing to say. I picked up my bag. I took out the folder. I set it on the coffee table between us. Connor looked at it. He didn't touch it. I said, "This is 7 years of mortgage payments, bank statements, correspondence with the lender, and a letter from my solicitor, who I called on Thursday, outlining the legal concept of a resulting trust." He blinked. I said it again more slowly because I wanted it to land properly. A resulting trust is a legal principle that applies when one person pays for a property that is registered in another person's name. And the short version, the version that matters in a living room in Harrogate on a Sunday afternoon, is that financial contribution to a property can establish a beneficial interest in that property regardless of whose name is on the deed, and that 7 years of mortgage payments, fully documented, is not a gift with no strings. It is a contribution with legal weight, and my solicitor had written a very clear letter explaining exactly that. Connor's face did something I had never seen it do before, which was go completely still. He said, "You'd take Mom and Dad's house to court." I said, "I'm not taking anyone to court, Connor. I'm telling you what the legal position is so that we can have an honest conversation about it, which we should have had 7 years ago and again when the will was written." My mother was in the kitchen. I think she could hear everything and had chosen not to come through, which I understood. Connor said the will was clear. I said the will was written without full information, and that my solicitor had advised that this was a situation where the court would take a serious interest in the documented contributions. He said I was being aggressive. I said I was being accurate, and that the folder alone would shift the conversation. Was that I had already spoken with the mortgage provider, because the mortgage was actually still running for another 2 years, and the lender had confirmed in writing that the payment history was entirely associated with my account details and direct debit. Not my parents', not Connor's, mine, which meant that there was a paper trail of a very particular kind sitting at the lender's office with my name on it. And that paper trail was also in the folder. Connor picked up the folder eventually. He read quietly for about 10 minutes while I sat there and did not fill the silence. When he put it down, he looked tired rather than angry, which was the response I had hoped for because tired people problem solve and angry people perform. He said, "What do you actually want?" I said I didn't want the house. I had never wanted the house. I wanted us to sort it properly, which meant acknowledging the contribution, working with a solicitor together to figure out what was fair, and making sure my mother was protected through all of it because she was still living there, and that was not changing regardless of what Connor and I decided. He asked if I'd spoken to Mum about the legal position. I said I had told her I'd taken advice, and that she knew there was a conversation to have. He said he needed time. I gave him 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were uncomfortable in the way that honest reckonings always are, but they were not catastrophic. Nobody stopped speaking, nobody made it ugly. And at the end of them, Connor came back with his own solicitor's advice, which aligned fairly closely with mine. And we began a process that took 3 months but ended with a written agreement that reflected the reality of what had happened over the previous 7 years. Connor kept the house, which was right. His family needed it. His children were settled in their school. Uprooting them would have been genuinely cruel, and I was not interested in being cruel. What changed was the formal recognition of my financial contribution, structured as an equity stake in the property, not a debt, not a loan, not a favor returned, but an actual documented share of the asset that my payments had helped preserve, which Connor would buy out at current valuation if he ever sold or refinanced. My mother watched the whole process with a sadness I recognized as guilt, and in one of the quieter moments she said to me, "We should have talked about this properly at the beginning." I said, "Yes, we should have." I didn't say it with anger because by then I didn't feel angry. I felt resolved, which is different and better. What I think about all of it now, from a distance of several months, is this. The mistake was not paying the mortgage. The mistake was paying it silently, as though the act of doing something good meant the record of it didn't matter. As though love should be enough of a document. And I understand why I thought that at 32, and I understand why it was wrong. Because love is not a legal framework, and family is not a substitute for clarity. And the people who love you most are sometimes the least equipped to hold the full weight of an undocumented financial arrangement without the edges eventually slipping. I kept the receipts. Not because I was suspicious, not because I was planning anything, but because I am an organized person who documents things. And in the end, that habit was the only thing that turned a situation that could have been completely devastating into one that could actually be resolved fairly. Connor is still my brother. We had Christmas in Harrogate. My mother made her usual chaos of a roast. His kids were loud and wonderful, and at one point he looked across the table and said quietly, "I'm sorry it took the folder," and I said, "I know," and we left it there, which felt like exactly enough. If you have ever paid for something in silence and then watched someone else take the credit, you already understand this story better than I can explain it. Keep the receipts, not as a weapon, just as the truth, because the truth sometimes needs somewhere to live until the room is ready to hear it.